Our first story deals with a subculture of heavy metal music that some feel is sending a dangerous message to your kids.
The forces of evil on the dark side of devil right.
And I want to talk tonight about the devil and demons and witches and wizards.
And we just mix it up with hardcore and aggression and come out with something we think's an original sound.
Loud, fast, heavy, you know.
Well, what do you got?
What do you got?
You're listening to Riff Worship, the podcast that attempts to answer the age-old question, what makes a riff? Why do we worship all things the riff? I'm one of your illustrious hosts, Austin Paulson. With me, as always, is the great bald hope, Arkansas's prodigal son, Dylan W. Adams. Dylan, how are you?
It's good. It's cold.
Yeah, it's cold.
It's actually fall. It's finally fall here.
I know.
Blistery, sub 40 degree day in Tennessee. It's nice. I had to break out the good hat for the old noggin today.
It's gotta stay warm, bud. Can't let it out in the elements. Yeah, it is a little gloomy up here in the north. This is probably my favorite time of the year just because, one, all the horror movies, and then two, all of my short black shirts become long black shirts. I'm wearing like the Bulls rip-off harm's way shirt right now.
It's nice knowing that I can walk into my home and not sweat from humidity. It's like, oh, it's 70 degrees outside, but the humidity makes it feel like 912.
That was probably my least favorite thing about living in Kentucky is that you could shower and then still be wet getting out. I mean, just sweating. I might have to take another shower just to like clean off from getting from the curtain to the bedroom.
Once I showered, I refused to go outdoors ever again.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, all right, I'm showered. You want to go? Nope. Sorry.
Some say you've never left the house to this day. I'm a curmudgeon. I'm a lecherous curmudgeon. I'm like a Gollum-esque character when it comes to going outside. I just hiss. And ain't that the truth? Well, as much as I love talking about your Gollum-esque ways, we do have an album that we'd like to discuss today. We've been talking about this episode for a while, and it kind of spawned through our conversation with Andy LaRocque a few weeks back. But an album that has experienced a pretty landmark anniversary, perhaps one of the best death metal albums of all time, or at least a very influential, pivotal record in the genre.
I could say yay to both of those. Honestly,
I guess really just get into it. It's Individual Thought Patterns by Death. You saw it on the link, you clicked on it, and we're going to be talking about it today. So, as with many of our episodes, I guess I want to start by asking, how did you get into Death? How did you find out about Death? Was it an early listen for you? Did you get to him later?
So with Death, and one thing I want to touch on before we get into how I got into him was we touched on this not only in our conversation with Andy, but also our Covenant episode. This album released on the very same day as Covenant, June 22nd, 1993, and was recorded at Morrisound Studios at the very same time, albeit with a different producer.
That's right.
I have a weird relationship with the band Death. Basically, they were one of those bands that when I started getting into death metal was just kind of being shoved down my throat as like, you have to listen to Death. If you listen to death metal, you have to listen to Death. When your first foray into death metal is Cannibal Corpse, it's kind of hard to go, oh, there's anything more aggressive than that, right? Which there are. There are definitely more bands that could be, perceived as being more aggressive as Cannibal Corpse. But with Death, my first introduction to Death was probably the same one as yours, which was hearing Spirit Crusher for the first time. I think I saw a live video, maybe from Dynamo Festival in like 98.
Yep, I'm familiar.
It was just that clip, and it may have even been on like Headbangers Ball or something like that. And I heard that and was like, this is kind of cool. This is all right. There wasn't much to it. It almost sounded like a prog metal record or a prog rock record to me, as opposed to like death metal. And then it was, you have to hear Scream Bloody Gore, Leprosy. This is like Death's best era. And it was much later. I believe I was in my early 20s when I finally got a chance to hear Human and Individual Thought Patterns. And I'll go ahead and say it. This is my favorite Death album. I love Human because of the lineup that they had with that and the song structure. That's when Death got weird to me.
Yes.
But this album is the culmination of all the weirdness with all the classic influences to it. It was much later when I got into this album. So I was in my early 20s. Matter of fact, I bought Symbolic when I was like 18 and did not like it at all. Thought it was kind of weak, honestly. Just, and that's just my 18-year-old opinion of it. I know a lot of people really like that record.
Yeah, it's not my favorite. I don't know if I necessarily would even go as far as saying they have a bad record necessarily.
Right.
I like The Sound of Perseverance. I think it's a good record, and I even like, the
Painkiller cover.
The Painkiller cover
That's
as
great.
well. I mean, hell, there's a Kiss cover on Human that I love, or at least like a bonus track.
They did God of Thunder, right?
Yep, they did God of Thunder. But yeah, I would say that I may be partial to Human just because it is, in fact, the first thing that I heard. I am familiar with the Dynamo video, but the first thing I remember seeing of this band was the Lack of Comprehension video, which I believe is their first music video, and it blew me away. I was like, I've never heard anything like this. I have never seen anything like this.
Right.
It's a very simple but like dark and eerie kind of video.
That's the video where it starts and there's the young man that's in the bed, right?
Yeah, he's like playing guitar. It's like,
Yep.
Obviously very relatable, I'm sure, to people where it's like, you're not necessarily understood. And maybe there's like,
It's the 2112 thing.
yeah. So it's like, it's an odd video. It's different, but it makes you think. And I think that's kind of where we're at with this era of the band where,
Mhm.
Maybe this band had started out being more caveman-esque,
Yep.
gore influenced death metal on Scream Bloody Gore, Leprosy. Maybe you kind of see a bit of a shift on Spiritual Healing, but this is definitely a more introspective band by this point. Chuck Schuldiner of Death, the guy, he is Death.
Yep. No ifs, ands, or buts.
In many interviews, he's on record as saying like, I'm trying to do something different from your deicides or, your cannibal corpses.
Yep.
I think he was trying to say something, life in general is already very brutal. Like real life
Yeah.
is very brutal. I think that was the point he was trying to get across. And I think there is a relatability to what he was doing as far as lyrically that connected with me in a very early age. So I heard the Lack of Comprehension. I watched the video. The first record I got was Leprosy. I went to a record store by the name of Kiss the Sky that was located. It was they used to be located in a like kind of a strip mall connected to Jules. And then they moved to Geneva, and I remember going there for the first time. I bought the first Slayer record, Show No Mercy, and then I got Leprosy. And I remember going up to the cash register. My dad stopped me and he's like, "Oh, what do you got? What do you got under there?" And he looked at both of those amazing album covers and just like laughed. He's like, "Whatever, man. Just here's a 10. Just get him."
With that lovely Ed Repka artwork. That is a very I think the artwork of that album is probably more known than the album itself.
Yes. I mean, some of the those like caveman groove, just pummeling riffs are excellent. You will find some of that on these like this era of the band, like your Human and the Individual Thought Patterns, like we'll get into. But like you said, this band, we've mentioned this in other episodes where there's a clear style or a clear defining sonic quality to each era, each album of this band, where it's like, all right, Leprosy, Scream Bloody Gore, maybe even Spiritual Healing a little bit, it kind of fits into that block of time for this band. And then you have Human and Individual Thought Patterns. And this is perhaps my favorite era of the band. Yes, it's more progressive. They're trying to push themselves as musicians. There's a skill. There's just so much going on. And yeah, Human is kind of the introduction to that sound.
Yeah.
I think maybe some of it is a little, it wasn't quite, reined in. Like
right.
Really, they're trying everything and it's great. You know, obviously you got like Sean Reinert on drums. You got Steve DiGiorgio on
Paul
bass.
Masvidal.
Yep. I mean,
Yep.
two guys from Cynic who are,
You have Cynic in that band, basically.
and they're so young. I mean, I believe they
19?
were still in high school. Yeah. If not just graduated. So there is a really cool backstory of that record and you know, how it came to be. But this is really where they take all of that influence, all of that, all of those progressive elements. And essentially we have just a monster individual thought patterns.
To kind of touch on Human for a moment, I always considered Human the weirder album, right? You've got two guys that went on to be in one of the most forward-thinking, like, death metal bands. It's hard to call Cynic a death metal band, really, even though it's lumped into that. You know, with these great jazz influences and these atmospheric influences and just overall these lush sounds that came out of that band. But Human was the weirder album. And there was a lot of exploration going on that record, which is completely polarizing compared to Spiritual Healing just a couple years before it, right? Completely different records, like a massive jump in what they were doing. And then you get to Individual Thought Patterns that has honestly a more refined approach of what happened on Human, right? You've got all the exploration from Human that went into this album, because you can definitely hear it in the structures and some of the riffs that were written, the songs that were written. But it's all very much more song based on this album. This is like the refined version of that era. This is, I think, the best representation of the technicality and the experimentation mixed with death metal or traditional aggressive heavy metal music, because you could even look at some of the death records post Human and go, that's just heavy metal with an aggressive vocalist and maybe more double kick. Like, there's definitely some rudimentary like guitar stuff on there.
I think this album in particular, while there is we're going to dive into some of these tracks. I mean, there's so many things going on rhythmically. Obviously, Gene Hoglan, who
the machine,
the Atomic Clock, Gene Hoglan. This is his first appearance on the record, kind of taking over for Sean Reinert. And you know, I guess there's always a thing too with the lineup changes of these. Obviously, as you kind of progress through their discography, there are a lot of lineup changes throughout this group's history. You know, there's definitely the lore as far as like problems with touring, and you could definitely dive into that, the backstory. And you know, you have two guys from Cynic, you would think, wow, it works so well on Human. Why wouldn't they have just kind of gone with that lineup for Individual Thought Patterns? And you know, perhaps they were busy with Cynic. Perhaps he wanted to do something else. I think it's definitely covered in the documentary Death by Metal.
If I remember right, in that documentary, weren't all the songs written with Sean Reinert in mind? Didn't he help write a lot of this? And then Gene came in.
So from what I understand, and I could be wrong, was that it's very possible that they were jamming for this record. It seems like kind of this has kind of been the thing that's happened a little bit, where they were writing with the next album in mind, perhaps, and then they went on tour. They got back, and I think he just didn't even call Sean to let him know that maybe they were going with Gene. They were just looking for maybe a different direction. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure. Obviously, he's no longer with us, unfortunately, to kind of touch on like what his feelings were, what he was trying to accomplish. But yeah, it seems like a couple times throughout watching the documentary Death by Metal, they're like working on, like even Steve, like they were working on Symbolic, and he didn't end up making it on that record, but he wrote, I think, a lot of those parts at least. So
with the whole Death catalog, I mean, there's definitely a few people that have came and gone out of this band. And you can see that there are a couple names that'll pop up and will stay a little while. The first record was essentially Chuck and Chris Reifert. That was it. Chris Reifert went on to become Autopsy, which Steve DiGiorgio played bass on the first Autopsy record. So there's another tie-in. Steve was supposed to play bass on Scream Bloody Gore.
Yep.
I mean, there's a lot of tie-ins with that. I mean, with all the lineup changes, I think I'm interpreting that Chuck had the same process with lineups that maybe a Glenn Danzig did, where it was, hey, every album can have a different lineup because it's essentially just a different sounding record, and I want it to sound different. And I think a lot of that, comes with maybe people that are a little more enigmatic, maybe have very strong personality traits, maybe have those alpha personality traits, which it definitely seems like Chuck did. But you also get these great results from all of that too. I mean, we might as well just dig into the lineup of this record with what we've got.
Gene Hoglan, this is his first record for the group. They had met previously while Gene was in Dark Angel. And there was a thing of like them going on tour together.
Mm-hmm.
I think there was some sort of deal because both bands were on Combat Records.
That's right.
So there's the tie-in. You got equal billing. Now, I believe there was an issue as far as what that means. It's like, equal billing is not exactly co-headlining.
You're
so
right.
That became a little bit of a problem. And, like you said, there's that different egos or different mentalities of what this is supposed to be.
Mm-hmm.
And Death ultimately ended up leaving that tour. So there was a bit of a bad blood or a little bit of beef between Gene and Chuck for a long time. And so I think later on, Gene Hoglan was essentially kind of making his exit from Dark Angel. At least they were kind of winding down. People are going off and doing different things. So he's kind of looking around. And so I think word got around to Chuck and to Gene that, hey, I'm looking for a new band or looking for something new to do. Oh, well, they're looking for a drummer. So you have that connection. And it seemed like once they got on the phone, they just kind of picked up from where they were before. It didn't even really matter anymore. So thus you have Gene Hoglan playing drums on this record. And that double bass is like all over. Some of these like little flutters and really, I mean, it's what you would expect from a metal band, but he's also really, it's almost very like jazz influence. He's really just all over the kit. It's wonderful.
It definitely sounds like, and I believe he touched on this in the documentary, that he was a fan of the Human record, was a fan of Sean Reinert's playing. And I believe he probably took some of that and went, okay, this is already a thread from the last album, the last era of the band. What can I bring to the forefront, but still keep some of that, style, keep some of that flair in there. And obviously Gene is the drummer of drummers, right? Yes. His catalog of bands he's played with has been extensive, and who he's filled in for. I mean, my God, he's in Testament at this point. Actually, he's not. My apologies. He's no longer in Testament. But he was in Testament for many years, and it just shows that all the things he's done, like he can do anything. He's not just the fast heavy metal drummer, although he does that probably at the top of the rung. There's not many people that are better than him.
Which is, it's great. Obviously his career has been long established. He's one of the dudes. He's one of like these forefathers of the genre, forefathers of this style of playing. And what I found interesting kind of doing some research for this episode was that he kind of said this was really where he became a drummer.
Right.
Because if you look back before, he wrote a lot of the riffs for Dark Angel. He was playing a lot of guitar. And so he felt that maybe the drums were taking a back seat in that band. Now you only have one job. You are the band's drummer. So really you just kind of get to fly. And he fucking does that perfectly.
It's why I love some of those Strapping Young Lad records. And those are very drum centric recordings of those. Is like his feet are impeccable. And if I remember right, he either practiced or he played with ankle weights on for a while, just to add more speed to it. And he'd play in like combat boots. It was the wildest thing I've ever seen. But you've got an addition of Gene Hoglan, the Atomic Clock joining the band. Then you've also got the second record with Steve DiGiorgio. in which we touched on a little bit of his history with the band. He was supposed to be on Scream Bloody Gore. That didn't happen. He had his fulfillments to the band Sadist in some of his recording work he was doing at the time. But when it came around to record Human, obviously he was a shoo-in. You know, he was known for playing fretless bass. That was a different aspect on the Death album. To bring in a fretless bass player, especially in death metal. That's probably one of the first instances, if not the first instance in death metal, to have a fretless bass player on there. And he's all over that record, albeit the only caveat and gripe I have to that record is the original mix has him buried. Yeah. You can barely hear him. Now on the remixes that they did of that, which we're going to touch on with this album, the remix on Human is great. I think everyone loved the remix on that one. But you get to hear him. Yeah, you get to hear him all over that record. Now, you fast forward a couple years to Individual Thought Patterns. He is very much up front in the mix. He's a big proponent of it. He adds this different texture to it. He's all over this record. And this is one of the first instances of like hearing the band's catalog that I think Chuck was just clearly like, I trust you to do what you do, have at it. Because based on interviews that I've read of his, based on videos, whatever, he never really had cuffs put on him. Steve, that being, never really had cuffs put on him by Chuck. He could essentially play anything he wanted. And it just made sense because he knew Steve was going to play for the part. And he's all over this record. I mean, there's parts on this record that are completely nuts. I mean, the walking line in the song Destiny is absolutely one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard. He's a big part of this band's history. I think he's as important in certain periods as Chuck is, because he comes off as such a level-headed musician. Obviously, Steve is known for a very dense technique that he has. He's one of the first guys to use the repetitions of 3 to do notes on the bass. So he's playing with 3 fingers. He doesn't get a lot of the credit he deserves, I think, because you've got guys like Alex Webster and if anybody follows this, Alex Webster actually called Steve DiGiorgio's home to figure out how he did that. Really? And Steve had to explain it over the phone of like, here's how you do it. And obviously Alex took it and is now the pinnacle of bass playing in death metal. But he learned it from Steve DiGiorgio, who is, again, it's funny to think this because you don't really put the name there, but Steve was in a lot of the really early runnings of what classic death metal is. I mean, he's on the first Autopsy record. Like, he's got his hands in every bit of it.
Yeah, and then even to tie it back again to Testament. I mean, they were in Testament together. Steve and Gene, they had a lot of run-ins with each other, it seems.
They sure
did.
Years.
So, and then also, if I'm not mistaken, they do the Death to All tour.
Yep.
So, and kind of a way to celebrate this era of the band, celebrate the catalog. I feel like they even kind of touched on too. I've not ever seen it live, but it's a way for them to kind of revisit some of those songs, but also do it in kind of like a modern way as well. So they kind of add
those modern touches to it.
I love it. It's so cool.
I haven't seen a lot of the videos from that kind of collective tribute. I have seen, I think, 1 or 2 videos, and I think Matt Harvey might have did guest vocals for them at one point. Mm-hmm. That's before this most recent band he created. But this album was recorded as a 3-piece, essentially.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to touch on with Steve as well was this is the first time I was not, I was a metal guy, I was a rock guy. I never heard fretless bass before. I never heard it quite like that. And so when I would hear some of these little, like, these runs,
the horn sounding things,
the little slides that he does, he adds to it, all of these little details, I was blown away. I was like, what is he doing? Like, what instrument could this possibly be? You listen to some of the earlier records and, there's nothing wrong with Chuck's playing on the first record. There's nothing wrong with, your Terry Butler, but I feel like it is more kind of straightforward where you're kind of playing along with the guitar. Whereas this is, like you mentioned, running all over the neck. The arrangements are set up in a way where he really has the time to breathe and really just kind of paint with such large brushes and strokes that, you can hear it. You can hear everything on this record. But you're correct. this record was essentially recorded as a 3-piece. And so this is kind of the point where we touch on our former guest of our show, Andy LaRocque, who, obviously a long time standing current member of King Diamond, essentially invited to play on this record because they didn't have that second guitar. Obviously, like we mentioned, you kind of lose the guys in Cynic. They're doing their own thing. All right, where do we find kind of our second instrument here? And from what I understand, we kind of touched on this in the interview, is that they got connected through there's like an A&R guy for Relativity. But yeah, Andy LaRocque essentially comes out from Sweden to play on the record. He's there for like maybe a few days, and he is able to record his parts. Now, I guess we have Andy to talk about this with. So maybe we should turn things to him to kind of explain how this came to be and some of his memories from recording. So here's Andy LaRocque.
Here's Andy.
Another record that experienced an anniversary this year, 30th anniversary, Individual Thought Patterns, which you're all over that record as far as the soloing. I wonder how that kind of came to be. I know you guys kind of shared labels at one point with Roadrunner. Is it Monty Connor who kind of made that happen to get you in touch with Chuck?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Chuck attended at a few of our shows down in Florida, back in the early days, and he told me that he always been a great King Diamond fan, but we never really got in touch, until Monty Connor back then, like 92, I believe it was. He said, "Hey, I talked to Chuck, and he really wants you to come over to do some solos, for the next album with Death." And we weren't doing anything with King Diamond at the time, so I thought, sure, I got nothing else to do right now, so I'm totally in, for that, So he kind of put everything together, and I flew over to Tampa for like 10 days or so, and recorded some solos, and I had a good time with the guys, and Chuck, great guy, and Steve DiGiorgio, cool, and
Gene Hoglan?
Gene, exactly. Gene, I mean, he left the day before I arrived. And it took more than 20 years till we actually met the first time.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that was crazy. So I met him at the festival in Belgium a couple of years ago.
That's so cool. I would have never have guessed that.
Crazy, man. No, I never met him, but I met Steve a few times, of course, Chuck, a couple of times after, the recording and everything, He always called me on New Year's Eve. "Hey, Andy, it's Chuck. How you doing, man?" Until his passing, of course, which, very sad, but he was a great guy, man.
Very, progressively minded as well, as far as like the guitar. I feel like kind of a similar minded thing is that, with each record, kind of always elevating with each sound, always trying to get better and better. Did you spend much time working with Scott Burns at Morrisound? Did you have any interactions with him while working on the record, the engineer there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, not like a producer or anything, but I mean, as a musician, I got my small, back then, I had like a Walkman thing, so I got the songs on tape and just practicing along with that, and got into the studio with a few ideas and recorded it, and that's about it. I had some time recording solo like every day, for like 10 days, whatever, so that was good. And a cool thing back then was actually that Fleming Rasmussen, the Metallica producer, was actually in the studio at the same time.
Yes.
He was working with, I believe, I'm not sure about it, but I think he was working with Cannibal Corpse at the time.
So we actually covered this in another episode of ours. So 2 albums released on the same day, Individual Thought Patterns and Morbid Angel's Covenant. And so they were recorded at the same studio. And so, yeah, Fleming was working with Morbid Angel at the same time. So
Morbid Angel, that's right. I thought it was Cannibal. Morbid Angel, yeah, correct.
Which definitely a band that frequented that studio a lot. But so what was it like? Did you see anything in the background going on with their recording process, perhaps?
Not really. I met some of the guys, I believe, in the kind of studio lobby kind of thing, but that's about it. Said hi and talked a little bit, and that's it, but I think they were done with the recording at the time. I'm not sure, because I never really saw the guys. So maybe they were into the mixing phase or something. I'm not sure, And we were really busy with our stuff, so.
That's really cool. I mean, it's we were kind of talking about that before, where these two pivotal albums recorded at the same studio at the same time, they released on the same day. I just had to know if you guys ever crossed paths. So that's cool, at least in some aspects of that. Was there kind of like you mentioned with King? Obviously it's a lot of this project in Death is Chuck's baby. Did he have a particular way he wanted you to play, or did you pretty much have free reign to kind of let loose on those songs?
Oh, I just did my thing, I believe, and he wanted me to do that, There was like, I remember there was one part, that I just I wasn't really happy with it, And he told me, hey, maybe, Andy, maybe you could do something different on that part, and, I just, I need to do something different, and I think it turned out good, because I just, changed it around to something completely different, and it turned out good, There was only one part I really had problems on, the rest, he just let me play my style.
Another point I'd like to kind of touch on as well is that I'm not exactly sure Andy had like a lot to go off of when prepping for this record. Chuck did send him songs to kind of go off of, but they were only tapes that included sections of where Chuck wanted Andy to play. He wanted him to play solo sections. He wanted Andy to play solo sections on the record, but he only sent him those snippets of like, all right, here you go. So he doesn't really have like a context or full grasp of what the song is supposed to be like. I want to say that he did prepare some things, but without really knowing the full, quality of the song, it's really hard to kind of prepare yourself for that. So when he showed up, knocking on, Morrisound Studios' door, and they're like, well, I mean, I don't really have like a ton prepared. They were kind of worried, but by all means, you really kind of entered the studio and kind of told the guys, don't worry, like I'm a professional. I know what I'm doing, and laid down some of the coolest lead lines on this album.
And you hear them essentially immediately. They're on the first track.
They sure are.
Like within 20 seconds, you hear him like harmonize.
Yeah.
He's right there because it sounds like a punch in. It's up front in the mix.
Yeah. Overactive Imagination is a really great start to the record. It starts fast too. There's really they're not wasting time. They really get in there, and his melodic style is very clear. What I love about this record too, it's kind of like when you listen to, I don't know, when you listen to like Megadeth, for instance, right? Yep. And there's definitely some crossovers there as far as like lineup changes and maybe absolutely. The lead guy kind of running things here. But whenever you listen to a specific record that features a different guitar player, you can hear the difference in Dave's playing versus whoever's on the record. And I feel like you get that. It works perfectly to get this.
Yes.
They're trading off, but I know, just being a fan and listening to these records for a long time, that I know the difference in Chuck style versus Andy LaRocque style. Bringing that King Diamond influence on this record, which, obviously these guys are huge fans of, and they're fans of Merciful Fate. They know those records. I'm sure it was a big treat for them to have him in the studio and playing on this stuff.
Well, you're right. It's hearing the contrasting styles, and that's why I like this era of the band as opposed to maybe the first three records. Those first three records, when I hear those, I instinctively know those are rudimentary ground basics of death metal, right? The guitar playing is there. It's not bad. It's just that's very fundamental for death metal. But when you hear Human, you hear the phrasing and the technique and the stylistic changes that are brought in by Paul Masvidal. And then you hear this album and you immediately, as soon as the first note is hit on Overactive Imagination, when Andy's like layered in there, that's Andy LaRocque. You know that's him immediately because it's his calling card. It's his tagline from playing with King Diamond for so many years, from his influences there. Chuck was a big fan of those Merciful Fate and those King Diamond records. And that's why he wanted him on there. He goes, oh yeah, that's who I want on there. It's because he was a fan of his style. and you hear Andy's influences all over there, like as he talked about the Scorpions and so on and so forth. But he's all over the record. He may be only in a couple spots, but the way Chuck wrote for this record akins to that style of music. So it sounds like he's all over the record.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I kind of mentioned, Andy coming into the studio from Sweden, obviously Morrisound is a huge hub in Tampa, Florida for this style of music. Obviously, you have Scott Burns, who had worked with Death previously to this recording as well. Likely anything of note from this era of death metal and extreme music perhaps came from Morrisound Studios, as well as Scott Burns being at the helm of working on it production-wise.
So touching on that Scott Burns production, this might be one of his best sounding productions. Because let's face it, I think he was learning how to produce these bands as they were going through. Some of the early death metal albums sound a little muddy, but he's learning. You can clearly tell by the time he left this world that the records were sounding better. And this sounds really crisp and really mixed well. Comparing this to Beneath the Remains or like Slowly We Rot, like you hear the production on those, which were 5 and 6 years, maybe even 7 years before, to this album are vastly different productions. And this is a really crisp production. Essentially every Death album is produced by Chuck. Let's face it. Scott mixed it, Scott engineered it, that sort of thing. He actually hit record, whereas Chuck was going, I want it to sound this way. I want this amount. I want this, level of dB, whatever it may be. But this is one of Scott's better recordings. It's any listen I've had to this, I just still concede that this is one of his best recordings. And luckily we've got Decibel Magazine is putting out a great book on Scott's career, basically, and it's like a 400 to 500 page book on that. So that's going to be great.
I can't wait to dive into that. And I think you're totally right as far as this may be one of his better sounding records that he worked on. But it's not a fault that the other records may sound lesser or whatever. I'm not saying that at all. I guess this is literally like maybe one of the first guys to really understand what those records should sound like. So yeah, he's trying to figure it out in real time. And we have so many classic records because of it. And, as we mentioned, as Andy mentioned, Morbid Angel also recording Covenant in the same studio around the same time. And I think they perhaps ran into each other as well. The, kind of the context of like a lot of the stuff going on, and we touched on this in the Covenant episode, is that really this was perhaps death metal's peak at the time. This was,
absolutely,
literally Covenant on a major label. You have, some of the other records coming out at the same time. Entombed Wolverine Blues came out this year.
Talk about a polarizing record. Was that one?
Yeah, no kidding. And then also another polarizing record, Carcass Heartwork, another major label release for a death metal band as well. Then you also have some black metal coming out around this year as well. Dark
this was
Throne,
the big Dark Throne record, right?
Under a Funeral Moon. You have some doom happening as well, and maybe the other side of the country with Sleep Holy Mountain. Sludge coming out of New Orleans Houdini. At this time. You have Houdini came out this year. Definitely a record I would love to touch on at some point. The Take Is Needed for Pain record. I Hate God. So there's a lot of things happening in underground music at this time. Death metal kind of hitting its peak. And, I think records like Covenant and Individual Thought Patterns certainly kind of mark that peak of this era.
Death metal may have been at its peak, but you had like this weird resurgence of the 90s was really strange, right? With what music was being signed to these larger labels and was expected to sell. We've touched a lot on that. But you also had bands that were really like shaking the ground a little bit, making some headway. You had 2 big records put out by Roadrunner Records, which we'll again touch on a little bit. You had Typo Negative's Bloody Kisses, the Roadrunner Records' first gold record, I believe.
Okay.
You had Sepultura's Chaos AD, which is a game changer album for that band. Brought them to the mainstream. On a past episode, in the big mainstream portion of it, you had Nirvana's In Utero came out the same year. You had grunge at its height. This was a really weird time for music, and all of these labels, which we touched on this in the Covenant episode. All of these labels were really looking to go, who's going to move units? Who's going to do this? So they were taking chances, and we got all these great records during this time. I mean, Death was signed to Relativity, which has a lineage of like different heavy bands and hip hop acts. I mean, it's a laundry list of records from bands such as Bolt Thrower, Carcass, Entombed, Confessor, you know, bands, you know, with many more that I'm missing. But 93 was a peak year for a lot of underground forms of music with black metal. Honestly, the second wave of black metal was having its like height during this point as well. Between like 93 and maybe 96, when you saw that, this was during the period when we started hearing inklings of Varg, Vikernes, and Euronymous and all of this other stuff. You know, this is a period of time when death metal was being viewed as the overproduced subgenre, which is hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned in a previous episode, Covenant, where, you know, Blessed Are the Sick was basically the record that Fenriz heard and was like, this is awful. Yeah. I don't want any part of this. And so you love that, essentially have a shift from being a death metal band and kind of doing this other form of extreme music. So a little bit about this record too. One thing that sticks out to me on Individual Thought Patterns is obviously it's very technically proficient. Obviously it is very well produced. It sounds great. It's also a very angry record. This is
Chuck
just
Big Mad,
scathing record. Lyrically, it is like every song is a diss track. It feels like, you know, you could really make up who it could be, but every song on the album seems like he is like directing his anger towards someone in particular. And wow, I mean, you could go through some of these lyrics. I mean, even on the first track, Overactive Imagination, there's the opening lines: life for you is performance, play out the leading role, directing and premeditating every move that creates the act of manipulation. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some backstory there with Eric Riff, who was the band's manager. They had some problems in Europe on the tour. There's a lot of European tours that this band had some issues with, whether canceling shows or canceling full tours, where, you know, it left a lot of people with some bad taste in their mouth. But, you know, I think Eric Riff described that he perhaps, you know, he's a diabetic. He had to stay in the hospital at one point. They all got sick on tour. And so he was having to kind of organize some of the shows and check in with promoters and venues, like from the hospital or off of the bus, essentially. And so it was just a lot. And I think, you know, being on tour is very hard. I've not experienced it. I can only imagine what being gone for like, you know, weeks, months at a time will do to a person. So I think there's just a lot of emotions flying. There's a lot of, you know, there's just so much happening on a tour and making sure things go right, especially in this era where, you know, I mean, obviously it's still tough now, but this is, you know, with technology, it's impossible.
Yeah, this was definitely during a period of time where, you know, information was few and far between when it came to touring. Things were probably still being booked via a landline phone or even a phone booth at that point. You know, using an atlas while driving, especially if you're trying to, you know, traffic Europe, which, you know, our highways, our roadways, our, you know, our systems are a little bit different here than they are there. Having to traverse that when you're an American that's never been there before, and having to go through all that, I'm sure breeds a lot of contempt, breeds a lot of anger, breeds a lot of resentment. And when you've got, you know, when your support group, your manager, whoever that may be, and you're having issues with that, you're having issues with the labels, issues with former band members, you know, anything like that. This is the first album he really let loose on like that. Everything else beforehand was either, you know, zombies, monsters, gore, social political stuff with Human, some personal stuff with Human as well. But this is the first album he really was just like, you know what, fuck all of you. You know, this is who I am. I'm going to just let loose and just let everyone have it. I mean, even the songs themselves, without hearing the lyrical phrase, are angry. It's very, you know, I saw a negative review of this record and they called it directionless, which I've seen a lot of records that are really angry called directionless. It's because he was hitting everybody. You know, he was angry at every single thing. And I don't think he ever really let it be known who and what all the songs were about. But you read between the lines, it's there. You look, I can't remember the title of the song, but I interpreted them as like individual thought patterns. I interpret that title as having your own thoughts on what you perceive to be whatever the subject is, and not falling in with, not being a sheep, basically, right?
Yes.
Not following a pack of people. I mean, that's enough to title that album that way. I mean, that's a clear statement.
Yes. Doing things to the beat of your own drum and kind of like picking out people for maybe being performative or what have you. I think obviously there's a lot of Chuck is against a lot of, kind of doing things the same way everyone else is doing. I feel like one thing that is clear about Chuck is that he always wanted to be different or not be lumped in with, the tropes of death metal. You look at some of those interviews where he's, wearing the cat shirt, the famous interview there
kitty cat
with
shirt.
Andy LaRocque. I've heard stories where the dude would wear flip-flops on stage. Like, it didn't matter to him being different and writing differently, having different musicians on your record that maybe look at arranging songs differently. I think that certainly shows. And yes, people who had crossed his path during this time were definitely a target.
It's funny that we bring this up, like kind of playing things to the beat of your own drum. Chuck wearing sandals, flip-flops, wearing old running shorts on stage. Decibel Magazine just had Tomb Mold on the cover, and the internet community was just pissed off at the fact that these guys were on there in 5-inch inseam shorts and like a t-shirt. It's like, oh, they look like everybody else that likes this type of music. And for whatever reason, everyone got real bent out of shape about it. And it's like, oh, for the love of God, just get out of here. Like, come on.
Well, talk about a band that really just kind of is truly unique, or at least like these past few records. I mean, they really just kind of have been doing whatever they wanted to do, whatever sounded cool to them. And I think, the latest record, I just got it in the mail the other day. It's so cool. I mean, there's definitely some symbolic influence on there. I think there's some of this record on there. Absolutely.
Yep. There definitely is, with those guitar layers and guitar harmonies that like Death is kind of known for those fifth guitar harmonies that are all over it. That's kind of their thing. It's all over it. It's all over this record.
Yes.
But Chuck definitely ran to the beat of his own drum. Very strong-willed person from all of the information that I have on him. Very strong-willed, very forward-thinking, even when it may not seem that way. He definitely had an agenda and a plan for every one of these records when they came out, what he wanted to do with them. To a point that we saw what we saw at the end of his career. He was completely transitioned out of playing death metal at all. He was going in and playing like what is known as power metal today, but was just like a classic kind of heavy metal meets progressive rock leaning record with those recordings. But he did things his own way.
Yep.
It didn't matter what amount of success he did get from it or didn't get from it. He did things his own way. And, we could get in the weeds on that all day long, but, we're here to kind of dig into this great record that we've got. You talked about, all of the song titles. I mean, there's, is it the third track on the record? It's called Jealousy. I mean, come on, you can't be any more straightforward than something like that.
That's a good track though, man.
It's a great track.
Oh my God. I mean, this one in particular stuck out to me as far as, and there's a lot of this on the record where there's a lot of diversity rhythmically. I mean, there's like start stops, like there's so many things going on. Jealousy was like certainly a song too. Speaking of rhythm section, where the bass really came full and like, oh, Steve DiGiorgio is here and he has arrived. Like, so noticeable. There's like a little, I don't know if you necessarily call it a solo, but there's certainly like a line where he is just in the forefront. You have Andy and Chuck trading off solos, as we've mentioned throughout this song as well. And of course, the scathing lyrics. You want what is not yours.
Yep.
You want what you cannot have. Definitely very impactful. Definitely so many things you could try to piece together in your own mind. Do you have any other favorite songs from this record?
I want to get into that, but I want to touch on this with the lyrics. We talk about how Chuck had this great mind for writing, but he doesn't get near the credit for kind of his lyric prose that he should, because he had some inventive shit. I mean, it's not like even the gore stuff he did early on was great. I mean, is it Pull the Plug that has the line, "Why don't you choke?" Or am I getting two songs mixed up here?
Dun, 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 yeah, no, I think that's
yeah. Why don't you just pull the plug? I mean, that's a great line. And choke. There's a song called "Choke" on it, I believe.
Yeah.
That is, again, and someone's going to butcher me on this one, but I mean, he knew catchy song structures and catchy and lyric structures because he grew up listening to Kiss and classic rock. I mean, like we all do, like I know when I write the stuff I write, I want it to be catchy. I want to have like, where's the hook? You've heard me say that forever. Like, where's the hook? Yeah, it's heavy, it's aggressive, but where's the fucking hook? With my favorite tracks that are on this record, I know Trapped in a Corner is probably the most known song on the album for a fucking reason. It's a great song. It's a massively good song. I mean, it's a laundry list of what heavy metal should be on that album.
Yeah, that's definitely a highlight for me on the record. Again, rhythmically, it's like bam, like amazing riffs on this record, guitar harmonies and melodies. Again, you have some of maybe the best guitar work by Andy on this record on this song in particular. There's a really bouncy breakdown, and it's, I don't know, man. That was definitely a highlight for me on the album. There's like you mentioned, you wouldn't think normally with death metal or extreme music that there wouldn't be like a hook, or like something catchy about it. But there really is just that, there's a lot going on. It's a very dense record, but there's always something sticking out with each song that really sticks with you. Songs like Nothing Is Everything. There's like a really, really cool, awesome, like classically influenced guitar line on that track as well.
So I would say my favorite two tracks on here are Destiny, for the obvious reasons of Steve. That might be Steve's standout bass line on the whole album. There's a certain point where it's like, it's not even a walking line. He's just highlighting all of these like chord changes with like arpeggiating these notes. It's wild. Out of Touch has one of the coolest fucking like middle riffs to it. Gets me every time. It's a classic Death thing that Chuck does, and like you'll see that in a lot of his writing, but like it just really sticks out. And obviously, The Philosopher. Honestly, wouldn't have been my first choice for a single. It's a weird song. It's got some and even the tail end of it, the bass ends the song.
Oh man, I love that.
You hear him,
it just kind of fades out, which is funny because you listening back to some of these songs, there's definitely like a hard out maybe at a lot of the end of these tracks. This one is just kind of, obviously to end the record, it just kind of
it ends.
You could be playing forever. I love that's, again, the video obviously is a big part of why I love that song. I want to get into that in a second, but yeah, I would say, as I mentioned, probably Trapped in a Corner is a favorite. Philosopher's a favorite. Going through some of these, I love Destiny for that like acoustic part in the beginning, that acoustic section. That's not really a thing that you would perhaps normally hear with this band. Songs like Out of Touch and I want to say Mentally Blind have these like really cool keyboard parts that kind of make their way from human, but also sound like a precursor to what would ultimately become symbolic as well. Right. Those are really cool. They sound very big. There's like, they're epic sounding. Obviously Control Denied is like a very kind of epic sounding big
and it's
band.
Not keys for the sake of like, here's a traditional like piano part. It's purely synths as a kind of background and atmosphere. That's purely what it highlights, I think that was a trope in heavy metal music for a long time. I was like, oh God, it's got keyboards on it. It's terrible. It's because people would try to play keyboards like a piano and it would be terrible. Like some of those early, early heavy metal records that had keyboard on them. Whereas like this was more in a sense of, we want to set a theme and an atmosphere with this. And I think that is a tie-in from those old horror films, man. You look at like Phantasm, right? sets the theme. Like that's the first thing that comes to mind. The Exorcist sets the theme. Evil Dead sets the theme. You know, you look at all those old synth tracks. I'm sure these guys were listening to Goblin as well. That seems to be a big thing amongst the heavy metal community or the death metal community. You know, we talked about the track philosopher. We alluded to the video. You know, let's dig right in. Yeah. I remember watching Beavis and Butthead as a kid. It was still on TV because I'm that fucking old. And seeing this one, the philosopher video, you know, many years later, and realizing what it was, and hearing those guys they compared it to
was it Jeremy?
It was Pearl Jam.
Yeah,
they
Jeremy.
compared it to that video, making fun of his vocals.
Yeah.
Like this video got a lot of airplay on MTV. Surprisingly,
it's true. I mean, I think that the important thing to note is that Death did have, you know, obviously the lack of comprehension. And this video was likely being played on Headbangers Ball at the time, but that it's such a small audience that it's not like that show was on every day. You'd have to wait throughout the week and probably at the late hours of the night just to catch a video. Whereas this is a very popular show at the time. And while they're ripping into the band and Death and Chuck, you know, you're still having like 40 seconds of this video. I'm sure somebody heard that and was like, actually, I really do like that.
Oh man, that's the Florida Swamp. I definitely want to see that.
It's kind of what I've mentioned in previous episodes where like somebody is playing me something, a Cannibal Corpse video or a song, and it's being played to me for comic effect. They're digging, look how ridiculous this shit is. But at the same time, it's not, now I'm a fan for life because this is just so insane. It's so heavy. I've never heard anything like it. I'm almost maybe even terrified. Like I want to know more about this. But I mean, talk about a statement to end the record. I mean, it's another like very like scathing track, but the video is odd. It's an odd
video. It almost looks like it's filmed the same way as the Lack of Comprehension video was filmed. Just very much like, let's just use the same people.
Yeah, it's
Isn't Ralph Santola in this video?
Yeah, so obviously Andy LaRocque is not like a member of Death. Like he has his commitments elsewhere in King Diamond. He had to go back to Sweden and fulfill that. But yes, so you have Ralph Santola who kind of fills in on the during the live shows, the tours of this in the United States, and so he is featured in the video for the album as well.
And I don't think Steve's in the video. I think it's somebody else, or I could be getting that.
Steve, I believe Steve's in.
Steve's not in the Lack of Comprehension video. Then that's another.
No, guy. That's the Cynic guys. And then I'm not sure who's actually in the bass player that's featured in that lineup, but I don't believe it's Steve, but Steve is featured in this video. Gene Hoglan's featured in this video, but you do have a different guitar player who is around for the filming just because he's fulfilling the tour requirement as well.
Ralph has a bit of a lineage in death metal as well, and many other things with some kind of odd tie-ins you wouldn't imagine. Ralph is very stylistically similar to the way Andy LaRocque plays. The first time I heard Ralph Santola play guitar was on a Deicide record that came out in 2006 called The Stench of Redemption. He made Deicide a better band. He was also in Iced Earth, which
Obituary?
He was an Obituary right before he passed away. You are right. But he was in Iced Earth, and that's a very fitting band with like some of its stylistic choices of like this like over the top, classically composed kind of power metal-esque stuff. Ralph would have fit right in with like the Control Denied stuff, honestly. Good player. Yeah, glad to see he got highlighted a little bit with his band. I want to touch a little bit more on the Beavis and Butthead thing. A little bit. I'll make it short. But I watched Beavis and Butthead as a kid. My father showed me the movie when I was a kid. But the best memory of Beavis and Butthead I have is when they watched the Pantera video for This Love, and they were mocking Phil Anselmo and just kept calling him Pantera, and they were saying like, "Oh, this guy's stepdad is really mad." I'm like, "God damn it, Pantera! This beer is warm." Like, just that's why he's so mad, and that's just stuck with me.
They've made fun of Morbid Angel, Crowbar. Dude, some of the I don't know if I ever seen one where they were like they dug
Guar.
a particular Guar. There you go.
That's
and
it.
that's like,
That's
of
it.
course. Who else would be their favorite band other than
But
Guar?
I mean, they're in the video game.
Yeah, so it makes sense. You have the video, you have the album, you have the backing of Relativity.
Mhm.
I want to say they definitely did some European dates for this,
Yep.
which again, this band having kind of issues or kind of some fiascos that happened on tour. They finally did get to tour Europe. They hit all the dates. I think Steve and Gene were like a big factor in why that worked. Maybe just a kind of a good support system for Chuck to be out
Yeah.
there on the road.
That's, those guys may not have been on the first 3 records, which always get regarded as the classics for this band. And, one of the guys played on Human, which is kind of is the classic to me. That's the album to like measure this band by. But Steve and Gene were always kind of this voice of reason for Chuck. Even when they weren't in the band, like he trusted those guys a lot. And it may have been because they weren't just like bending to what he said. Maybe it is because they're like, hey, that's not a good idea, man. This is, more so what you want to do. Almost like an older brother situation.
Yeah.
With the touring that they were able to do with this record, it almost makes you think like maybe if this band had started during this period, it would have made so much more sense for Chuck. He's a little bit older, maybe not as brash, and he'd been able to go out and do the things he wanted to. Obviously, we didn't get a whole lot of time with Chuck post this album because it would be remarkable to see what he'd be doing now. Hell, he'd probably be filling in for like, at this point, some traditional heavy metal band at this point. He'd probably be playing fill in for like a band like Satan or any of those acts like that. Stuff he was a big fan of.
I'd love to know, it's unfortunate to have to be talking about this from a point of what if, where would he be? Would he revisit some of this stuff? Obviously, like, the records that came after, they're different sounding. I like them for what they are. I think, when you get to Sound of Perseverance, he didn't want that to be a death record. He was kind of out.
That was a label. That was a label like tie-in.
Yep.
They would Nuclear Blast would sign Control Denied if they gave him a death record, and it was just like, okay, I'll see what I can just pull out of my ass. And those were a lot of Control Denied riffs.
Yep. And
that were on that album.
I like some of that stuff too. It's different. It's, when I first heard it when I heard it for the first time, I was like, oh, this is interesting. I wouldn't have figured him to be, I just playing guitar. Like he didn't even want to like, all right, you take care of it. I'm done
His
with that.
vocals are massively different on that record.
Absolutely.
Too. They're high.
Yes. And
Really
obviously I that perhaps may have to do with his illness as well.
Yeah.
Or just, for a long time of really just wear and tear on the vocals. But this at least stands as a pretty classic record in the genre at a time where, a lot of bands were probably trying to nip at the bit of like what's working well. There's a lot of bands at the time that were they just sounded the same. And so you have these bigger guys who are kind of at the forefront, leading the charge, making your covenants, making your individual thought patterns. There's really not else that needs to be said. This is a classic album. If you haven't listened to it, I would highly recommend listening to it. It's kind of like one of those records that stands as like, all right, obviously we're in a renaissance now. There's so many great bands. But if you're interested in perhaps like checking out some of the history and some of those like foundational, pivotal records, this one would be a recommendation that I would certainly give. This is like a record with like, here's the blueprint. All right, now go run with it.
This is how you do it. This is the as our third co-host that I always make a point to mention in every episode. Justin Swindle has said about our definitive statements we make. I'm going to make one right now. This is when I think of Death, I don't think of any album after this one. This is kind of my stopping point with the band. I did not enjoy Symbolic, and I don't necessarily enjoy Sound of Perseverance. I can hear those albums and go like, oh yeah, that's off that record. I can hear anything off of Sound of Perseverance and know it's on that record, even before I hear the vocals.
Right.
I can hear stuff on Symbolic. It just sounds that album just sounds like a little soulless to me.
Gotcha.
It sounds like there's some stuff on there that's kind of cool, but I just go, it's a little too far in that melodic kind of like European style of writing for me. Whereas this album still had very much a culmination of things that really made me like it. And that's why, yes, Human may be the pinnacle of this band, but this is my favorite Death album.
That's fair.
Of all time.
That's totally fair. And so as we've mentioned earlier in the episode as well, they've kind of since gone back and remastered or remixed a lot of these records.
Yeah.
Relapse has been kind of responsible for a lot of that. Eric Greif's company as well. I think they've kind of allowed for this to, all of these like new physical packagings and new releases of these records, new editions. I want to say it kind of started perhaps with Steve DiGiorgio, where he was like, wouldn't that be cool if we did some of that? We should. I mean, Chuck, it seems like Chuck always wanted to remix Human.
Right.
And so maybe that kind of started the process here.
It started with that record for sure. They remixed and remastered that album a handful of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Got a great release through Relapse. Got these great expanded editions with all these demos and outtakes. But no one mentioned Individual Thought Patterns. No one needed to remix that one. And I know we've talked about it off air, but this remix and remaster upset a few people. Steve DiGiorgio in particular, that isn't known for really getting upset about a lot of things. It just kind of hit him the wrong way.
Yeah.
Because it kind of changed the way the album sounded, the way the approach is. Matter of fact, I don't think you can actually find a vinyl copy of the original mix anymore.
Wow. I mean, I will say I've heard him say that it's an improvement, but yeah, I mean, with this record, I don't know if he really needed to go as far as remixing it. So yeah, I've heard him say it's an improvement, but I almost would have liked to have seen more of an improvement or more. But they also didn't really. They did this, they did these kind of remix and remasters of these records, but they didn't necessarily include the people who actually worked on them. Obviously, it's Chuck, unless you got like a Ouija board, I don't know if you could really get some input on that, but obviously Gene and Steve are around. That you could maybe invite them to kind of not even. I heard him say he's like, I would have just liked to have been like a guide, almost like, hey, this is perhaps what we were going for. Like, you don't even have to listen to me. It would have just been nice to have been like have some input on this at all. I heard an interview with Gene and Steve together while I think they were on one of those metal cruises, and Gene didn't even know that they had remixed it. And obviously they're doing other things. They're probably not so much concerned with stuff like that,
right.
But yeah, it's it was kind of an interesting perspective to hear where it's like, okay, here's the guys who actually played on the record and they're not even really involved in the process for how this record came out or how this new version of it was released.
The only positive I could see anytime they remaster a record is that they get the album out to people that weren't able to get it. It puts it back in production. It puts it back in circulation. The remix, as Steve said, sounds good. It's an improvement. It sounds more modern, meaning like you can hear a lot more of it. I mean, Alan Duchess did a great remixing and mastering on it. Look his name up. He's done anything and everything. Overall, with all, it wouldn't be a Death album without a little bit of like chaos associated around it though. Yeah. Great album, classic album to me. I have trumped this era of the band for a very long time. And I think this era of the band, luckily with our age group, this era of the band gets a lot more attention paid to it. Whereas maybe the older guys paid more attention to, the first era, and some of the younger guys are going to pay attention to the later era because that's going to be the thing that they dig into. But overall, classic record, great record, fun record, inventive. It's another Death record.
We've reached that part of the episode where we like to recommend a few things to listeners out there, some things we've been jamming on over the past week. Dylan, what have you been listening to, man?
So first off is the newest released from American black metal band Woe. That's WOE. Their album Legacies of Frailty that came out on Vendetta Records. I got a chance to see this band at the Stone Fox in Nashville quite a few years ago. I just went to a show on a whim, and
Stone Fox.
This is a great album, just great American black metal. American black metal is a little bit different, obviously. a little bit more depressive almost, which is a funny thing to say. So great album for this time of year. And then the newest released from Carnifex called Necromantium. Carnifex is a California-based deathcore band, death metal band that has, in my opinion, went more so the symphonic kind of death metal area, and they've done it for a long time. They're one of the stalwarts of the subgenre. And I've also been going back and listening to some Unearth records. I got a chance to see the Revocation Unearth tour a few nights ago, and Revocation's great, always will be. I love seeing that band in any iteration, but Unearth headlined, and I hadn't seen Unearth since I was 16 years old.
Oh, really?
And oh my God.
It was like 70 years ago.
That was like 70 years ago, man. And the band came out, played a lot of songs from their 2004 record, The Oncoming Storm, and played a mishmash of some songs from later records. But the albums I always fall back onto that band are 2004's The Oncoming Storm and 2006's 3 in the Eyes of Fire. In particular, if anybody wants to check on the album for that band, I'm always going to suggest one of those two.
Perfect. I haven't been listening to much this week. There is a new record out, however, by the band Svalbard, The Weight of the Mask.
Yes, that's right.
This is a record it's out now through Nuclear Blast Records. It's their first for the label, as I understand. I'm a latecomer to this band, to be honest with you. I got into him kind of late. You had turned me on to him. Actually,
that last album's really good.
My introduction, I got into that record later as well, but the Noctool, the kind of like a pandemic
that's
project,
right.
basically. Serena Cherry basically recorded all of the instruments for a like Skyrim'd influenced black metal record, and I love it.
Done on like GarageBand.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic. So I love that. And then having heard that, I went and listened to the Svalbard records, and this is a cool one. I would highly recommend it. This is I'm a newcomer to this band, so this is a great start. It sounds very cohesive, and I think it's been getting a lot of buzz as of late. So check that out if you haven't. Some other new music as well. 2 new singles by the band Year of the Knife.
Those are rad.
Though their album No Love Lost is going to be out on October 27th, obviously kind of following the really tragic bus accident that happened a while back. But I believe the singer has been since released from the hospital. So still kicking, still kind of healing.
I believe all the funds that are going to be generated from that record actually go straight to her.
I believe as well. I mean, the community around this band, the hardcore community, the metal community, fans of the band have really kind of stepped up and really done some great things to help support a band in, really terrible, terrible time. But the record, I mean, the 2 songs that I've heard so far, they're quick, but the first single, Wish, features Devin Swank from Sanguisugabog on a track. And then the second single, Last Laugh, also features Dylan Full of Hell.
Yep.
And
I can hear that snotty kind of rasp on that thing immediately.
so great. I mean, I love when bands do the kind of like the feature thing where they have like their friends or some guest appearances on the record. So if you haven't checked out those 2 tracks, I highly recommend that as well. They're awesome. But that's pretty much it. We've talked about individual thought patterns. Thank you so much for joining us this week. You can always follow us for any updates on this podcast, as well as our live show, Vocal Distortion, at Distortion891 on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, it'll be the same thing. We're going to be talking about some more riffs here on Riff Worship.